The lifeline for North Vietnam's war in the South is a network of jungle paths and mountain streams. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is the scene of intensive warfare. Survival on the trail is held out as a model for all of North Vietnam. Everything is directed to war. North Vietnam itself is a guerrilla society. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is like a funnel. Men and supplies pour in at the north to emerge at the battlefields in the south. It isn't one trail. It's a network of jungle footpaths and dirt roads, canals and rivers that run generally north to south for 1,500 miles. It is a grueling, perilous journey. The trail begins near the coast, enters the western highlands through a narrow pass, then stretches south along the mountain ridge separating Laos and Vietnam. A Western journalist, Wilfred Burchett, traveled the trail.
It was improved the whole time. At the time when I first started down, it would have taken a good 6 months to get from the 17th parallel down to, say, anywhere close to Saigon. It went through very, very, very rugged, very, very difficult mountainous country and hair-raising sort of little swinging bamboo bridges. And there was no, in those days, there was no way of getting any vehicles down. And then later on, it got better and better and better and wandered in and out of Vietnam and Laos and at some points into in the northeast corner of Cambodia as well.
The trail and the Vietnam War develops from 1959 when North Vietnam decides to supply rebels in the south. North Vietnamese strategist Colonel Hao Van Lao.
And it became a network of strategic communications to supply our armed forces in every area of the front. And this strategic route network fulfilled its vital mission in the struggle of our people against local American war in South Vietnam.
By 1964, men and materials depart from organized assembly points along the coast. New jungle paths provide easier access to and through the mountains. Part of the trail runs through neutral Laos, so both sides at first deny there is a ground and air war. Official Air Force film identifies specific targets. Cutting the Ho Chi Minh Trail is seen as the key to ending the war. Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker.
If we cut the trail, the Viet Cong, I felt, would wither on the vine. The only thing that kept it going were supplies, weapons, ammunition from Hanoi.
Both the North Vietnamese infiltration and the retaliatory U.S. airstrikes increased daily. From 1964 to 67, the airstrikes tripled from 2,000 to 7,000 each month. By day, the pilots seldom detect movement. They can only strafe deserted roads and river fords. Gunships are also called in where communist infiltration is detected. Phosphorus bombs and rockets are used to strip away jungle cover. The North Vietnamese defend the trail with elite troops and artillery units. 25,000 North Vietnamese regulars guard the approaches to the trail. The communist defenses are considered too strong to be attacked by ground forces. Instead, the U.S. relies on the most concentrated airstrikes in history and on occasional commando raids. An army of 50,000 laborers keeps troops and trucks moving south, clearing the bombed mountain passes and repairing the bridges.
This strategic road network was permanently maintained by groups of pioneers, of young pioneers, men and women. And of youth groups who were ready at any time to repair the roads immediately after every aerial bombing.
À chaque moment, pour le réparer immédiatement après chaque passage des avions, après chaque bombardement.
Even with the very strict surveillance of the American planes on this road, never was the road cut.
Jamais la route a été coupée.
Despite the bombing, communist infiltration increases year by year. The U.S. military estimate that in 1965, 35,000 North Vietnamese troops moved south. In 1966, 89,000. In 1967, perhaps 90,000. In 1968, 150,000. The trail defenders grow their own food. Their campsites and truck repair depots spaced every few miles under thick jungle canopy. There's strict military discipline on meal times and rationing. Each camp has a medic unit. Some have nurses and surgeons. At key base camps, communist cadres even publish their own news of the war. Some American commandos couldn't convince their superiors of the extent of the trail organization.
I always felt that they disregarded whatever information we gave them. Always felt that. Because at times that Ho Chi Minh Trail was so busy. It really was like the Long Island Expressway during rush hour. And anybody that knows that such large amounts of men and materials are moving down, that knows that and doesn't do anything about it, obviously didn't want to win the war. And I'm not just saying my reports. There was a lot of electronic eavesdropping devices that were also dropped all over that trail. And the Air Force knew about it, the Army knew about it, the CIA knew about it, and yet everybody tended to disregard that information in terms of the enemy's capability of launching a full-scale attack.
I used to hear many people back in the States saying, why don't we plug up the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Why don't we just bomb the Ho Chi Minh Trail? Well, it wasn't one trail. I mean, there were thousands of trails. It was a network of thousands of trails, and there were thousands of R&R spots along the way where the enemy troops could seek refuge, build up, and I have to commend them. The NVA were some super soldiers.
The troops moving south stop one day each week at base camps. These provide what the Americans call rest and recreation, R&R. The most popular pastime against Army regulations is keeping diaries. As one captured soldier said, We wrote about the terrain, the scenery. We wrote poems and exchanged our diaries to read. At the height of the war, the journey south takes only 6 weeks, where it once took 6 months. Now they move by truck to assembly areas in North Vietnam and then through jungle passes into the mountains. On leaving the north, they get new clothes and equipment. Then from the supply camps, they start down the trail through Laos. An assessment of them by U.S. Commander General William Westmoreland.
They were a very dedicated group. The training of a North Vietnamese soldier involved more propaganda, indoctrination, than military training. They were tough. Their commanders were well disciplined and well trained, but they were ruthless and demanding strict obedience by the men under them, the men in the ranks. They had a fatalistic attitude where when they moved south, many of them had tattooed on their arms a statement, born in the north to die in the south. There was a great deal of discontent in their ranks, particularly among the very young and of the very old. And there were old men and young men that were drafted into service.
Before leaving, family visits are allowed, but soldiers are instructed not to tell their destination. The tour of duty is indefinite for those who travel south. As the war intensifies, fewer return. A typical day on the trail. They rise at 3:30 a.m., march for at least 10 miles or 10 hours a day. They put up hammocks, dig foxholes, cook and eat dinner, and prepare a rice ball lunch for the following day, the last duty before sleep. The rice ration is a pound or two a day. Luxury is a fish caught by tossing a grenade into a stream. On the march, they must carry 75 to 85 pounds on their backs. Their army kit, 3 shirts, 3 pairs of trousers, a raincoat, and a nylon tent. A few will take up permanent duty defending the trail. Tens of thousands die on the trail from the physical hazards of the journey. Eyewitness Wilfred Burchett.
Medical problems were rather bad, especially malaria. Malaria, some intestinal and respiratory things, but mainly malaria. But they had a very good production of medicines going by that time, both locally in South Vietnam. They had their little jungle clinics, and they had a pretty good pharmaceutical service in Vietnam, in North Vietnam. And everybody started out with whatever it was necessary, the prophylactic stuff against malaria of their own production. And one thing that was absolutely essential, which everybody had to carry, I also carried them, were sort of dice-sized cubes against a snake bite. It was a local remedy. If you got bitten by a snake, you broke the thing in two, clapped it on the one half on the actual bite, and swallowed the other half. You had to do it within 3 minutes. It was a death adder, because otherwise you would be stiffened up.
In late 1968, the U.S. prepares for a gradual troop withdrawal and begins an all-out attempt to stop communist infiltration. Airstrikes against the trail tripled to 200 each day. Bombing of the trail increases the cost of this air war to $1 billion each year. In total, the U.S. loses 500 planes over the trail. American High Command claims success on the ground. 25,000 trucks are destroyed on the trail in one 7-month period. But it becomes clear that bombing the trail cannot stop the North Vietnamese war machine. The trail by now is a sophisticated communication system.
In the beginning, it was a very, very miserable sort of collection of trails. Gradually, it became a major, more or less, highway, accompanied with a parallel pipeline. For the big offensive in '75, they were getting their fuel pumped down just to wherever they needed it. So it was absolutely decisive from beginning to end.
By late 1968, U.S. intelligence reports that 10,000 trucks are using the trail at any one time. The trucks operate in relays, traveling 40-mile stretches. Each section has its own repair crews, supply dumps, and fuel depots. The vehicles are kept strung out along a grid system of vertical and horizontal paths. When one route is bombed, the column of trucks switches to a side path. A labor gang immediately repairs the bombed section. New technology is tried. Sensors are dropped to pick up the movement of men and vehicles leaving the trail. The exit routes become a little easier to detect. But finally, it all comes back to the village level. Here, reliable information is hard to get. Despite controversy, more defoliants are used to destroy jungle cover in the lowlands. According to the Pentagon, by 1967, the communist convoys deliver 60 tons of supplies a day to the south. It is enough to sustain the war. Food, weapons, and ammunition are dispersed to hundreds of small units in the countryside. American reliance on large-scale attacks is criticized by Special Forces soldier Dave Christian.
They were trying to fight a guerrilla war with conventional methods. And they were fighting a defensive war. And so they had all these support troops and all these support mechanisms. And everyone, you had Signal Corps over there, you had all these different things that I'm sure were needed, okay, and were probably used in World War II. Possibly in Korea, but they were outdated and outmoded in Vietnam. Mainly you take your large infantry outfits, the guys that are fighting the war. The reason you don't come into contact is they make so damn much noise. Walking through the jungle, you'd think it was a herd of elephants coming. And if I had a team of guerrilla fighters, 8 to 10 people, I would not engage with that large of a group.
Unable to block the trail, the American command concentrates on the exits. The Iron Triangle, a 40-square-mile area north of Saigon, is a major infiltration point. General Westmoreland defends large conventional operations.
War Zone C was a heavily forested area north and west of Saigon along the Cambodian border. And it was, the Vietnamese, before we arrived, would never dare go in there because it was totally dominated by the enemy. The enemy had great tunnel complexes in there. They had their headquarters well dug in and camouflaged. They had their supply dumps there. And it was necessary for the sake of protecting the pacification effort and for preempting the capability of moving into the populated areas, for us to go in and to disrupt that. But you couldn't go in with a platoon, you couldn't go in with companies, you couldn't go in with battalions. They would have been chewed up. They would have been ambushed and decimated. And therefore, it took a massive troop efforts to go in there with safety and get the job done with minimum losses. And that was done.
Westmoreland prefers a direct attack on the trail, but Washington rejects this. It would require 4 infantry divisions at a time when the U.S. is seeking to withdraw troops. Instead, the military launched massive operations against communist base areas. A field commander, General William Depew.
There were operations which were called search and destroy. It turns out that was an unfortunate choice of words. What it meant back in 1964, long before it became unpopular, was simply that U.S. units or Vietnamese airborne units or Marine units would patrol in the jungle, not in the cities, not in the towns, in order to try to find the main force units, search for them, find them, fight them, and destroy them. Later, I guess it became associated with pictures of troops searching villages and setting them on fire, and the word destroy became a dirty word.
In a typical operation, helicopter units make a surprise descent on suspect villages. In operational areas, villages are considered base camps. The people are presumed to be communist supporters and are often forcibly evacuated to government camps. For most of the war, North Vietnamese infiltration via the Ho Chi Minh Trail enables them to control at least 60% of South Vietnam's countryside.
Leave the rice and bring the documents back with you. And call 6 India.
Homes are searched for weapons and documents, then often burned to prevent any use as communist sanctuaries. U.S. forces, though having greater mobility, rely on in-and-out tactics, seldom holding the terrain. When American forces withdraw, the straw huts and the communists soon reappear. Known communist villages are bulldozed and the cropland leveled. But across the countryside, the communists develop underground hideouts linked to the trail. They regard the trail as their route to victory. As the Ho Chi Minh Trail develops, so does the legend of the guerrilla fighters, an image of them from soldier Tim O'Brien.
Around 12 o'clock at night, for example, we would group up, maybe, we worked usually in a company of maybe 100 men, and roughly a half of those would group up at midnight and sometimes darken our faces. We'd throw our helmets off because helmets were useless. They impaired hearing at night. They were heavy. It was hard to march with them. We'd throw everything aside except our rifles, our ammunition, a canteen of water, a claymore, and a radio, essentially, and begin zigzagging through this ghost land we call Vietnam. It was eerie. There was almost a mythology about Vietnam among the soldiers, that the land was populated by ghosts. We called the Viet Cong ghosts in my element, platoon. You know, the ghosts are out tonight. The ghosts will get us tonight. It wasn't very often Charlie. It was ghosts, and that ghostly feeling was there. It was like a wonderland. It was like Ichabod Crane riding through Sleepy Hollow at midnight. Trees seemed to be moving, seemed to be actually lifting off the ground, wavering, shimmying. The wonderland, we called it. Ghostland, we called it. There was a feeling that the Viet Cong, because we called them ghosts, and because they were so ghostly, you never saw them. You'd see a shot of flame as they shoot at you. You might see a shadow very rarely. But they seemed to be capable of incredible things. There was mythology that they could crawl through barbed wire, that they were immune to barbed wire. They were capable of supernatural sorts of things, so we thought, and so it seemed. And an image of the enemy began to grow of an enemy capable of the most incredible sorts of deeds.
To the U.S., the most puzzling aspect of the North Vietnamese is their ability to absorb such great damage. Despite America's vast commitment to the war, many policymakers claim the U.S. lacked basic knowledge about its enemy and so developed the wrong strategy. After 20 years of involvement, the U.S. military had few recognized intelligence experts. General Edward Lansdale.
Well, looking back at the Vietnam War, it strikes me as very odd that we really didn't know any of the leaders on the other side. We, meaning not only the American people, but probably our presidents and our leadership in Washington.
From its guerrilla beginnings in 1945, Ho Chi Minh's nation is shaped by men dedicated to a communist Vietnam. Their faces, names, and background are largely unknown, yet the wartime leadership remains essentially unchanged. There is the political mastermind. Name, Le Duan, born 1908 in South Vietnam. Le Duan, like his colleagues, becomes a Marxist in the fight against the French. He develops the political organization. Le Duan spends years in South Vietnam organizing the guerrilla resistance called the National Liberation Front. He takes over as first secretary of the Communist Party. There's the longtime prime minister who directs day-to-day government and becomes Hanoi's public voice. Name, Pham Van Dong, born 1906 at Hue, Central Vietnam. Dong is highly educated, the son of a Mandarin. He helps found the Viet Minh, the peasant movement which fights the French. He negotiates peace in 1954. The agreement partitions Vietnam. He becomes prime minister, and as premier sees Vietnam united 21 years later. There's the military mastermind. Starting with 34 volunteers, he eventually commands a 1 million-man army. Name, Vo Nguyen Giap, born 1912 in Central Vietnam. Giap is politically active from age 14. Though poor, he studies law, then teaches history. His wife dies in a French jail. He joins the Viet Minh. At age 27, he plans the guerrilla strategy which defeats the French. He has military command for 30 years. And there is the legendary president, at first unknown even to the Vietnamese. Name, Nguyen That Tan, born 1890 in Central Vietnam. The world knows him as Ho Chi Minh, one of his many aliases. At age 21, he goes to France to seek political reforms for Vietnam. He spends years in Russia and China, returning to his homeland 30 years later. In 1945, he proclaims independence. 30 years of war follow. In the North, Ho creates a single-minded society with one goal, one Vietnam. An expert on North Vietnam, Brian Jenkins.
We're also talking about a society that is enormously disciplined, a society that historically was well disciplined, and during the course of the war, every aspect of that society was geared toward fighting the war. I mean, we're not talking about a society with a free press, we're not talking about a society with open debate, we're talking about a society where the production, the economy, every newspaper, virtually every poem, artistic activity was all geared toward that war effort.
The war in the North is most intense along infiltration routes near the border with the South. The U.S. bombards this region almost daily for 8 years. Hanoi diplomat Ha Van Lao.
À l'arrivée des avions ennemis,
When the enemy planes arrived, everyone participated in the anti-aircraft defense, whether it was an active defense, such as manning the guns, or whether it was a passive defense, one of creating conditions in which the civil population wouldn't be harmed by the bombing. And after the planes left, everyone would pick up their work, whether it was in the factories, the fields, the city, or the country.
To guard the border area, the population of the Vinh Linh region goes underground. Year by year, they extend the tunnel community. According to Hanoi, the strange world of Vinh Linh finally winds for hundreds of miles, sheltering 70,000 people. Vinh Linh is upheld as an example of national sacrifice. People are encouraged to serve here. Between bombing raids, the peasants cultivate livestock and crops. Trenches crisscross the fields. The tunnels are organized like a city. There are nurseries, hospitals, recreation areas. Most of the population has never known peace. The entire society revolves around the war. Journalist Wilfred Burchett.
It was compulsory for the kids to wear green camouflage when they went to school. It was roughly whatever the vegetation was in the area. But I remember once driving through, and to my great astonishment, a whole field of maize suddenly got to its feet and charged across the road. And these were the local peasant militia.
The priority is to keep open supply routes. Women militia are drafted to defend them.
Women played a very considerable role. In the early days, my first visits, I would say about half of the local village self-defense units, and probably more, were in fact women who actually, you know, knew how to handle rifles and grenades and whatever it was. In the north, the women had very largely taken over from the men in agricultural production. You saw women everywhere working in the fields and doing jobs which previously women never handled at all, plowing and harrowing and that sort of thing.
Our army was by nature a popular army. It was composed of three categories: the local militia, the regional units, and the units of the regular army. An ordinary fighter in the regular army was normally 20 to 25 years old. The majority of them had secondary school education. And they had the possibility of continuing their studies in night classes, if conditions permitted it. Entertainment, relaxation, that was the business of the cultural section of the army. And we attached a great deal of importance to it for our fighters. There was a cultural team that offered dances, singing, music. They even organized basketball teams, volleyball teams. Teams of athletes would compete against one another. The army versus the civil defense.
General Giap's military hero is Napoleon. I've lost some battles, but never lost a war, says Giap. Effectively, his army is the entire population. Whether in or out of uniform, everyone is assigned war duties. The leadership sets an example of self-discipline. The Prime Minister lives in the servants' quarters of the former colonial governor. Party Chief Lê Duan receives a salary of $10 a month, the same as all other government officials. Ho Chi Minh constantly tells them, stick together. They do.
In terms of their personal life, our leaders were very much united because they struggled under the same conditions. They'd been in the same prisons. They fought together, shoulder to shoulder. That's why the experience of the common struggle united them, not only in ideology, but in a life of revolutionary struggle.
Une vie de lutte révolutionnaire.
Ho Chi Minh regards his role as a teacher who could achieve greatest results through personal contact, and what he taught was patience. During 8 years of bombing, towns in the border provinces are destroyed. Nam Dinh, North Vietnam's third largest city, it is a transportation and textile center, frequently bombed. The damage is widely publicized. Visitors taken to the city 50 miles south of Hanoi find churches, homes, schools destroyed. Most of the 90,000 population is evacuated, but they adjust, says Ha Van Lao.
That is why, in spite of the very savage, very barbaric bombings of the enemy planes, life had to continue.
La vie devait continuer.
9 out of 10 workers in key industries are relocated in mountain caves. Some move 3 or 4 times as a result of the bombing. A typical Hanoi machine tool factory is broken down into 50 separate workshops scattered outside the city. Work continues in 3 shifts to maintain the war in the south. Individual hardships continue for 30 years. Food is about subsistence level. In 1967, the monthly ration per person is 1 pound of meat and 8 pounds of rice. In a year, each person is allowed 5 yards of cloth, enough for 1 shirt and 1 pair of trousers, the standard dress for men and women. Some workers are relocated hundreds of miles from their homes. As a result, some children are separated from their parents for years. This has happened before in Vietnam. The evacuated areas were first used in 10th century wars. They live now where their ancestors fought. The students wear the red kerchief of the Communist Youth Movement. The lesson combines a 1,000-year history of Vietnamese nationalism with Marxism. Communist affairs expert Brian Jenkins.
Without being deterministic about saying that one is trapped by history to repeat history, there were, to be sure, powerful historical forces in Indochina that did have a major impact on the course of events there. As an historian, I would tend to go back several centuries and to say that I could come up with patterns that had recurred over 500 and 600 years. They successfully attached themselves to these powerful traditions. They made history work for them. And psychologically and politically, this put the South Vietnamese and the Americans as foreign intruders very, very much at a disadvantage. They were able to take advantage of this powerful tradition of resistance. In some cases, one is talking about the resistance to Chinese rule for centuries.
All civilians must contribute to the war. Clearing highways and rail lines becomes a specialist task. An estimated 500,000 civilians, mostly women, are mobilized as repair gangs, traveling wherever needed. By 1968, Hanoi claims that 80% of all towns and cities of the north have been bombed. Hanoi has not been bombed. During the 1960s, the U.S. fears that destroying Hanoi might bring the Soviet Union or China into the war. But thousands of concrete cylinders are placed every few yards on each street as air raid cover. Half a million people, 1/3 of its population, are kept in Hanoi in fixed industries and government jobs.
Everyday life had to continue. Above all, production had to continue and even intensify. Because if we hadn't increased production, how could we have kept ourselves supplied to continue the war? In the urban centers, to save the life of the civil population, we dug trenches everywhere.
The shovel becomes the tool of national survival. A 16-hour workday is normal for decades. The chief strategy is to outweight the enemy. The money North Vietnam spends on the war is unknown, but the war does demand tremendous economic sacrifice. In government stores, there are long queues for cigarettes called Diem Bien Phu. Luxury is a mosquito net. In the late 60s, food rations increase with Soviet aid. Even then, officials tell visitors, we are terribly hungry. But at all times, traditional Vietnamese culture is maintained.
And I can even say that we didn't lack for recreation either. There were performances. There were cultural evenings for the people. And when the night alarms sounded, we'd disperse. When the planes were gone, then the shows would begin again. And that was life during the bombings.
North Vietnam is regarded by American policymakers as a puppet state, first of China, then of the Soviet Union. But Hanoi tells the people they are fighting for independence. The North, in turn, cannot understand U.S. motivations. Hanoi does not recognize South Vietnam as a legitimate country. The war for one Vietnam is presented as a national crusade. U.S. policymakers underestimate the nationalist appeal of Hanoi's leaders, says historian Brian Jenkins.
I think when we talk about the North Vietnamese leadership, we are talking about dedicated Marxists, but dedicated Marxists who nonetheless are as traditional as the ancient Confucian mandarins that ran that country centuries ago. In fact, it's intriguing that some of the leadership traces its origin in terms of its own families, not the proletarian backgrounds, but rather to advisors to the emperors, to court mandarins in some cases. No, clearly the Marxism, while legitimate and true to those leaders, was very, very, very much something which one put on top of a Vietnamese nationalism.
After peace with America is celebrated, Hanoi still anticipates a drawn-out fight to attain reunification. Patience is regarded as both the greatest virtue and weapon. By this time, some of Hanoi's leaders have already been fighting for 50 years.
If one looks at Vietnamese history, and the communists certainly did, they are able to bite off half centuries in a gulp, whereas we think of 5 years or 10 years as being a long time. Ho Chi Minh's boast that they were willing to fight 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, or longer if necessary, was not an idle boast, but rather really reflected a Vietnamese perception of history. It made probably little difference to them whether ultimately they would achieve their ends in the year 1969, 1970, 1975. It could just as easily have been the year 2000.
Vietnam, 1945-75. 3 decades, 2 wars, 1 objective.
I haven't seen anything to indicate that at any time during the entire Vietnam War, even the height of the bombing at any time, that there was any threat to the stability of that leadership, nor in fact even any major debate within that leadership as to goals.
What united them, and what still unites them, is our environment. The ardent patriotism, the true patriotism. The profound love of independence and liberty that goes hand in hand with love of socialism.
Prime Minister Pham Van Dong answers the question raised over 30 years.
Why are you like you are? Why are the Vietnamese like they are? What's in you? What makes you tick? And he laughed and said, well, you know, what is our history? There's nothing else in our history except struggles. Struggle against foreign invaders, always more powerful than ourselves. Struggle against nature. We've had nowhere else to go. We had to stay where we were and fight things out where we were. And this, the result of this after 2,000-odd years, he said, is that it's created a very stable nervous system in our people. We never panic. And whatever new situation arises, our people say, oh, well, there it goes again. But he repeated this 3 times. There's nothing else in our history except struggle.